What the hell do you mean, your troops are pinned down?
Comrade Marshal, whether we are pinned down temporarily or not, the offensive will most certainly succeed.
I have adequate forces, and we are in a perfect position to turn our tank armies towards Berlin. If we can hold until the Americans get here, we will have fulfilled our mission before our people, our country, and history.
I regret what I'm going to say, but the order cannot be carried out. The move simply has no chance of success. I demand the approval of my request to withdraw the 9th Army.
As we saw in the previous episodes, the final act of the war, the offensive on Berlin, was led by Zhukov's first Belarusian front and Konev's Ukrainian front. Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front played a more supportive role by covering the northern flank. In this episode, we'll focus on the most dramatic sector, Seelow Heights, but it's important to note that the other sectors, and especially Konev's, were paramount as well to the success of the whole offensive. On the main axis of this offensive, 60 kilometers east of Berlin, the Seelow Heights rise 40 to 60 meters above the valley where Soviet troops are about to rush forward. As a result of this situation, German 9th Army Commander Busse can see all of Zhukov's preparations, and he can conceal his howitzers against the slope out of reach of the Red artillery. Behind the heights, the defense extends on a depth of 40 kilometers in a region that looks like a maze of woods and lakes. Stalin has put Zhukov and Konev in competition with each other for this last race. Under intense pressure and with no time for better preparation, Zhukov must rely on a very straightforward plan for his offensive. To compensate for this, he tries to reassure himself by resorting to a tactical trick. His troops will attack at night and dazzle the defenders by lighting 143 powerful DCA searchlights. The schedule foresees that Seelow Heights will be taken in the first day of fighting. Then 2 tank armies will proceed as quickly as possible to the suburbs of Berlin, something they must achieve on the 4th day. And lastly, encircle the city and penetrate the city centre. All this should be over in 6 days. But in practice, not all of this went as planned, especially at the beginning. Let's see why. In his book The Last Battle, Cornelius Ryan retraced the details of these historic moments based on eyewitness accounts of participants. They don't always match up with the official memoirs because of censorship, but more recent data and studies tend to confirm the following account. In a bunker built into a hill overlooking the Kustrin bridgehead, Marshal Zhukov stood gazing impassively into the darkness. He was there with Colonel General Chuikov, the defender of Stalingrad and commander of the 8th Guards Army. Ever since Stalingrad, Chuikov had suffered from eczema. He wore black gloves to protect his hands from the rash that affected them. Now, as he waited impatiently for the offensive to begin, he nervously rubbed one gloved hand against the other. Zhukov suddenly asked him,
Vasily Ivanovich, are all your battalions in position?
For the last 48 hours, Comrade Marshal, everything you have ordered I have done.
Zhukov looked at his watch. Settling himself at the bunker's aperture, he tilted back his cap, rested both elbows on the concrete ledge, and carefully adjusted his field glasses. Chuikov turned up the collar of his greatcoat, pulling the flaps of his fur cap over his ears to muffle the sound of the bombardment, took up a position beside Zhukov and sighted his own binoculars. Staff officers clustered behind them or left the bunker to watch from the hill outside. Now everyone gazed silently into the darkness. Zhukov glanced once more at his watch and again looked through his glasses. Then Zhukov said quietly,
Now, comrades, now.
It was 0400 hours. 3 red flares suddenly soared up into the night sky. Then, with blinding intensity, the 143 huge anti-aircraft lights, supplemented by the lights of tanks, trucks and other vehicles, focused directly ahead on the German positions. For just a moment there was silence, as the searchlights illuminated the area ahead of Kustrin. Then 3 green flares soared into the heavens, and Zhukov's guns spoke. With an ear-splitting, earth-shattering roar, the front erupted in flame. In a bombardment that had never been equalled on the Eastern Front, more than 20,000 guns of all calibers poured a storm of fire onto the German positions. The most fearsome sound of all came from the Katyushas, or Stalin's organs as the Germans called them. The rockets whooshed off the launchers in fiery batches and screeched through the night, leaving long white trails behind them. In this incredible bombardment, Zhukov's troops began to move out. Chuikov's well-disciplined 8th Guards led the way from the Kustrin bridgehead on the Oder's west bank. As they rushed forward, the artillery barrage remained always in front of them, carpeting the area ahead. North and south of Kustrin, where assault crossings had to be made across the flooded river, engineers were in the water laying pontoons and fitting together prefabricated sections of wooden bridges. It was a fantastic spectacle. The Oder was soon swarming with boatloads of men, rafts full of supplies, log floats supporting guns. Waves of Soviet troops were crossing the Oder without waiting for the bridges, tossing and bobbing in a variety of assault boats. In the ranks were troops who had stood at Leningrad, Smolensk, Stalingrad and before Moscow. Men who had fought their way across half a continent to reach the Oder. Many soldiers had seen their villages and towns obliterated, their families slain by the German invader. For all these the assault had special meaning. They had fought on for this moment of revenge. The Germans had left them nothing at home to return to. They had nowhere to go but forward. Now they attacked savagely. Equally avid were the thousands of recently released prisoners of war. Reinforcements had been so urgently needed by the Red Army that the newly freed prisoners had been given arms. Now they too rushed forward, seeking a terrible vengeance. Chuikov's commanders were making their first reports. Chuikov told Zhukov proudly,
So far everything is going as planned. The first objectives have been taken.
Zhukov, a tense figure since the opening of the attack, became suddenly expansive. He seized Chuikov by the hand and said,
Excellent. Excellent. Very good indeed.
But pleased as he was, Zhukov had too much experience to underestimate his enemy. The stocky marshal would feel better when the Seelow Heights were seized, and his mistrust proved right. A few hours later the mood already changed as new sobering data reached the Soviet headquarters. At first, Zhukov did not believe the news. Standing in the Kustrin command post surrounded by his staff, he stared incredulously at Chuikov and then spluttered in rage.
What the hell do you mean? Your troops are pinned down.
Comrade Marshal, whether we are pinned down temporarily or not, the offensive will most certainly succeed. But resistance has stiffened for the moment and is holding us up. Heavy artillery fire from the Seelow Heights had hit the troops and supporting tank units as they advanced. Also the terrain through which they are moving is proving extremely difficult for armor.
And indeed, in the marshes of the Oderbruch, self-propelled guns and tanks were thrashing and churning helplessly under constant German fire. Up to now, said Chuikov, his 8th Guards had advanced only 1,500 metres. According to some witnesses, Zhukov gave vent to his fury with a stream of extremely forceful expressions. What had happened to the supposedly irresistible offensive? Let's switch to the German side to get the answer. In his advance command post, Heinrizi was looking at the map. Most of his officers were awestruck by the force of the Soviet bombardment. 9th Army Commander General Busse described it as the worst ever, and Colonel Eisman believing the annihilating fire had practically destroyed the front-line fortifications. Heinrizi's difficult stratagem had taken most of the night. From all reports, in the areas where troops had been withdrawn, the manoeuvre had proved successful. Now, in the second line, the men waited for the advancing Russians. On this part of the front, Heinrizi had the advantage. West of Kustrin was the sandy ground of the Seelow Heights. The Russians had to cross this valley in their advance from the Oder, and all along the crescent-shaped mound, Heinrizi's guns were trained on the lines of approach. On these critical heights lay Heinrizi's only chance to blunt Zhukov's attack. Zhukov needed to seize the heights quickly, before Heinrizi's guns could shell the Red Army's Oder bridges and create havoc among the troops advancing across the low-lying, marshy terrain. The plan was to destroy most of the resistance with a gigantic bombardment, making the capture of the heights that much easier. But because of the German withdrawal from the front lines, the majority of Heinrizi's army and artillery were intact and in position. The defensive plan had gone well. There was only one thing wrong. Heinrizi did not have enough of either men or guns. Without Luftwaffe help in the air, and without reserves in men, guns, panzers, ammunition or fuel, Heinrizi could only delay Zhukov's offensive. Eventually, his enemy must break through. Along the entire front, Heinrizi's two armies had fewer than 700 operable tanks and self-propelled guns. Ammunition and fuel supplies were equally critical. Apart from shells stored at battery sites, the 9th Army had reserves sufficient for only 2.5 days. Heinrizi could not hold the Russians back for any appreciable length of time, nor could he counterattack, because he had dispersed what little armour and artillery there was to give each unit a fighting chance. He could do only what he had known was possible all along. He could buy a little time. As Heinrizi looked at the map and the broad red arrows marking the Russian advances, he thought bitterly of the panzers that had been transferred to Field Marshal Schörner's Southern Army Group to stem the Russian attack which Hitler and Schörner had insisted was heading for Prague. Those armoured units would have given Heinrizi 7 panzer divisions in all.
If I had these divisions, the Russians wouldn't be having much fun now.
Bad as matters were, they got even worse when Konev's first Ukrainian front attacked in turn across the river Nysa. Konev's troops did not experience the ordeal that befell those of Zhukov. Their offensive went on smoothly, and in a matter of hours it was already clear that a breakthrough was achieved. Zhukov learned of Konev's drive on Berlin from Stalin himself, and it was not a pleasant conversation. What was said no one knew, but the headquarters staff could see its effects on the commander. A witness recalled, "The attack had stalled and Stalin reprimanded Zhukov. It was a serious situation, and a reprimand from Stalin was often couched in not very mild language. Zhukov, a man with all the marks of an iron wheel about his face, and a man who did not like to share his glory with anyone, was extremely worked up." Meanwhile, in his headquarters located inside Kotwood Castle, Marshal Konev's call to Moscow came through. As he spoke, he reverted to the military formality that Stalin always demanded.
This is the commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front.
Comrade Stalin here. Go ahead.
This is my tactical situation. My armored forces are now 23 kilometers northwest of Finsterwald, and my infantry are on the banks of the Spree. I suggest that my armored formations move immediately in a northerly direction.
Zhukov is having a difficult time. He is still breaking through the defenses on the Seelow Heights. Enemy resistance there appears stiff and unyielding. Why not pass Zhukov's armor through the gap created on your front and let him go for Berlin from there? Is that possible?
Comrade Stalin, it would take much time and cause great confusion. There is no necessity for transferring armor from the 1st Belarusian front. Operations in my section are going favorably. I have adequate forces, and we are in a perfect position to turn our tank armies towards Berlin. I could send my forces towards the city by way of Zossen, 25 miles south of Berlin.
There was a pause, while Stalin referred to his own map. After a while he said,
Very well, I agree. Can you turn your tank armies towards Berlin?
Konev put down his phone, immensely satisfied. Confronted with a very difficult situation as his troops were pinned down on the marshes before Seelow Heights, Zhukov took a critical decision. Although originally his tank armies were not to be committed until after the heights had been seized, he now decided to throw them in immediately. General Chtemenko, the commander of the 1st Guards Tank Army, who happened to be in the bunker, got his orders direct. Zhukov left no doubt as to what he wanted. The heights were to be captured, whatever the cost. Zhukov was going to bludgeon the enemy into submission and, if necessary, bulldoze his way to Berlin. Then, followed by his staff, the stocky marshal left the command post, his anger over the delay still evident. Zhukov had no intention of being slowed up by a few well-placed enemy guns, nor did he intend to be outrun by Konev in the Berlin race. That evening the word went out from a grim Zhukov to his entire army group. Now take Berlin. And so at last, after an incredibly difficult day of fighting, Chuikov's guards and Kotkov's tankers had finally gained a foothold on the Seelow Heights by sheer weight of numbers. A little before midnight, the first 3 houses in the northern suburbs of the town of Seelow had been captured, but heavy fighting continued all through the night. Red Army attacks were smashed again and again by point-blank fire from anti-aircraft guns. The Germans didn't even have to aim, said a witness. They just fired over open sights. Not until the following night were the heights taken. It had taken more than 48 hours to break through the first 2 lines, and Zhukov believed that there were at least 3 more such lines lying before Berlin. At midnight on April 20, Heinrici grimly surveyed his maps and tried to analyze the situation. A few hours earlier, one of his fears had been realized. He now commanded not only the Army Group Vistula, but also Berlin as well. Almost immediately upon receiving the order, he called General Reimann, head of the Berlin garrison, and told him that no bridges were to be destroyed in the city. Reimann had complained that the city was defenceless anyway, now that the best part of his Volkssturm had been pulled out to man defence lines. Heinrici knew all about it. He now told Reimann to send along the remainder of the Home Guard.
Reimann, don't you understand what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to make sure that fighting takes place outside the city and not in it.
The Army Group Vistula commander then drove to Buss's 9th Army headquarters. All along the Oder-Neisse front the line was cracking, slowly but surely under Soviet pressure. Heinrici had been at the front all day, going from headquarters to headquarters, visiting field positions, talking to commanders. He marvelled that Buss's soldiers had done so well against such terrible odds. First, the 9th Army had stood off 3 days of heavy preliminary attacks. Now, for more than 24 hours, they had been taking the full force of the main Russian offensive. Buss's troops had fought back ferociously. Busse had harboured a secret hope, so guarded that he had never voiced it aloud to anyone except Heinrici and certain of his closest commanders. He had wanted to stand fast on the Oder long enough for the Americans to arrive. He told Heinrici,
If we can hold until the Americans get here, we will have fulfilled our mission before our people, our country, and history.
Don't you know about Eclipse?
Busse had never heard of it. Heinrici told him of the captured plan, showing the Allied lines of demarcation and projected zones of occupation.
I doubt that the Americans will even cross the Elbe, and even if they do so and drive for Berlin, it's probably too late. Hitler is obviously prepared to contest bitterly every mile of an American advance. He makes no distinction between the democracies and the communists.
Germany's position was hopeless. so was the Ninth Army's. But as long as Hitler continued the war and refused to capitulate, Busse believed he would try to hold the Russians up to the very last moment. The Ninth Army had taken the full brunt of the Russian attacks. It could not take much more. But although Busse's men are still blocking the Russians nearly everywhere, it was at a terrible cost. In some areas, officers reported that they were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1.
One division commander had telephoned, "They come at us in hordes, in wave after wave. We fire our machine guns, often at point-blank range, until they turn red hot. My men are fighting until they run out of ammunition. Then they are simply wiped out or completely overrun. How long this can continue, I don't know. Nearly every message is alike. There are frantic calls for reinforcements, guns, tanks, and, above all, ammunition and fuel are needed."
One item was irreplaceable: troops. Busse's few reserves were either already committed or were moving up. Most of them were being hurriedly thrown into the fighting at the crucial Seelow region. As he drove in darkness back to his headquarters, Heinrici found himself slowed by crowds of refugees. He had seen them everywhere this day, some carrying bundles, some pulling handcarts filled with their last possessions, some in farm wagons drawn by horses or oxen. In many places their numbers were posing almost as great a problem to Heinrici's troops as the Russians. At his command post, anxious staff officers gathered to hear the general's first-hand impression of the situation. Gravely, Heinrici summed up what he had seen.
"They cannot last much longer. The men are so exhausted that their tongues are hanging out. Still, we are holding. It is something Schorner couldn't do. That great soldier has not been able to hold Konev even for one day."
A short time later, the OKH Chief of Staff, General Krebs, rang up.
"Well, we all have good reason to feel satisfied.
"Considering the size of the attack, we have not lost much ground."
Krebs would have preferred a more optimistic response, but Heinrici did not make it. He told Krebs dryly,
"I have learned never to praise the day until the twilight comes."
And indeed, the next day their conversation took an even more dramatic tone.
"The situation is becoming almost impossible to control. It is extremely difficult for the 56th Panzer Corps, which, despite all counterattacks against the Soviets, is being pushed farther and farther back. The situation there is tense to the point of bursting. Overall, the Ninth Army's situation is worsening rapidly.
The Fuhrer's decision is that Busse will hold on the Oder.
Consistently, I have been denied freedom of movement for the Ninth Army. Now I demand it, before it's too late. I must point out that I am not resisting the Führer's orders because of the stubbornness of unjustified pessimism. From my record in Russia, you know that I do not give up easily. But it is essential to act now in order to save the Ninth from destruction. I have received the order that the army group must hold the front line in its present positions, and that all available forces must be pulled out to close the gap between the Ninth and Schorner on the southern flank. I regret what I'm going to say, but the order cannot be carried out. The move simply has no chance of success. I demand the approval of my request to withdraw the Ninth Army. It is in the interest of the Führer himself that I make this request. Actually, what I should do is go to the Führer and say, 'My Führer, since this order endangers your well-being, has no chance of success, and cannot be carried out, I request you to relieve me of my command and give it to somebody else. Then I could do my duty as a Volkssturm man and fight the enemy.'
Do you really want me to pass this on to the Führer?
I demand it. My Chief of Staff and my operations officers are my witnesses."
A short while later, Krebs rang back.
The Ninth is to hold its position. At the same time, all forces that can be made available are to try to close the gap with Schorner on the southern flank, so as to set up a continuous front once more.
Heinrici knew then that the Ninth was as good as lost.